Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Red Bull have questioned the legality of Aston Martin's AMR23. Helmut Marko says that it's basically a Red Bull clone from last year's RB18 and wonders whether it's actually illegal to take as many ideas and inspiration as they have done from last year's Red Bull to this year's Aston Martin. Does this case check out though? I'm not necessarily so sure. Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. So many comments coming out of Red Bull after this weekend saying we had three Red Bulls on the podium, only the last one had a different engine. So Red Bull number 1 in Max Verstappen's hands, Red Bull number 11 in Sergio Perez's hands, and then Aston Martin number 14 in Fernando Alonso's hands rounded out the podium. Now, did Aston Martin copy Red Bull is the big question here, because even Sergio Perez is coming in on this as well, and in fairness, the top two teams as it stands in the constructors are Red Bull at 43 points and Aston Martin at 23 points. So long way to go in the season, but for now, with the way that Mercedes and Ferrari are, there's a decent chance if Aston Martin's upgrades work and Mercedes and Ferrari don't make the progress they'll be hoping to make, that Aston Martin could be second in this year's constructors. Could they be first? Probably not going to happen, but you know, there's at least a chance. Aston Martin are clearly in the fight and Mercedes currently have the fourth best car. Now, even Sergio Perez was throwing a dig in as well on Aston Martin and Alonso, saying that it is nice to see three Red Bull cars on the podium. So there's a clear belief within Red Bull that Aston Martin have basically copied them. Now, in fairness, they did basically copy them last year, as we'll see here in a second. At least that was the argument at the time. And there is some evidence to back this up, right? Just because a lot of the Aston Martin engineers came from Red Bull not that long ago. Actually, 7 engineers in 2021 went from Red Bull over to Aston Martin. Among those, Dan Fallows, who's now leading up the Aston Martin development team, and he brought plenty of his guys along with him. And obviously, they remember some things of what they were planning at Red Bull, I imagine. And this year's Aston Martin is already quicker than last year's RB18, right? Apparently, the Aston Martin engineers say we didn't want our car to be as good as last year's Red Bull. We wanted it to be better. When they got to the wind tunnel, they were surprised at how well it had gone. So they'd taken maybe some of the Red Bull ideas and it had worked out so well, they thought they'd made a mistake because the car was so quick in the simulations and in the wind tunnel. And, you know, the AMR23 is better than last year's car, but Red Bull has also improved the RB19 by about 9/10 of a second, which explains the gap between the two cars now, which is more like half a second between the RB19 and what the AMR23 is currently capable of. Christian Horner as well made the same point. They say imitation is the greatest form of flattery, and it's good to see the old car going so well. So basically what Red Bull seem to believe is that this year's Aston Martin is a carbon copy of last year's Red Bull. So you know how it goes. A few years ago, Tracing Point, when they came up with the pink Mercedes, and you know, now they're coming up with a green Bull or whatever you guys want to call it. And certainly last year there was a green Bull. This year I'm actually not so convinced though. And I think the reason why Red Bull and also Mercedes might believe there is an element to this is because they have similar characteristics. They both go over the bumps rather well, have a suspension like a Rolls-Royce, as was described about a week or so ago. The AMR23 drives low and negotiates the bumps well, strong on corner exits. It has similar qualities to the Red Bull, and I think a lot of people are narrowing that down to the front suspension because Mercedes provides the rear suspension for Aston Martin, so it can't be an issue that they've managed to figure out there. These were the words though from Helmut Marko, taking it one step further, not just saying, oh, well done, Tracing Points, you know, you guys have done it again with copying us, but in fact, is this even prohibited by the rules? He says, it is true that what Dan Fallows had in his head cannot be erased. Copying the focus is not prohibited, but can you copy in such detail without having documentation of our car? We had 3 Red Bulls on the podium, only the last one had a Mercedes engine in rather than a Honda Red Bull powertrains engine as the Red Bulls have. So he's basically reckons that there's some documentation, and in fairness, I think Red Bull accused Aston Martin of this last year, that some of their engineers that had gone to Aston Martin had copied or taken documentation or, you know, downloaded files in the Red Bull computer to take over to Aston Martin, and I think they investigated that, and they weren't found there was nothing found as a result of it, but clearly he still thinks that there's something dodgy going on here, and they've not just remembered these ideas in their head, but have actually had it written down, which obviously is not allowed to take documents from one team to another in a process like that. But is the car actually that similar? That's the question I have to you guys in the comments below. So this is, if you guys remember last year, there was an AMR22A that they had for the first few races of the season and was absolutely atrocious. And then from race 6 or so, whatever Spain was, they brought in the AMR22B. So this is last year's car. And you guys can see very clearly that the side pod design on last year's Aston Martin looks even more like a Red Bull than the Red Bull itself, to be honest. Like this shape of the side pod was very Red Bull-esque, and it's not too dissimilar to what they've got on this year's car, but there are some differences we'll see in a second. So this kind of, this divot here, I suppose, in the side pod on last year's AMR 22B, they introduced a few races in, was an entirely different spec car, and people wondered, how have they been able to achieve this? Because, have they copied Red Bull already? But then Aston Martin said, no, we already had that in the wind tunnel long before the season began, which made Red Bull think, damn, how did they know before we even unveiled our car that we were going to look exactly like that? And Aston Martin say, oh, just lucky, I guess. So there was definitely an element last year, right, I think, where they probably had some inspiration from what Red Bull might have been working on before they then moved over to Aston Martin in 2021 while they were designing the 2022 cars. I think that's understandable. But this year, is it actually the same story? Because this is the 2022 B spec, right, Aston Martin up top, and this is the new Aston Martin 2023 car, and it's different in many ways. Obviously, the side pod is one of the most notable parts, but the front wing design and even the nose of the car and the back where you've got these kind of channels that even Mercedes have kind of gone for, there's many new elements here. Now, yes, they've got this deep undercut on their side pod that Red Bull have, but they kind of had that last year as well, and it's not as severe on this year's car at the bottom here than the Red Bull's currently years. They also changed the design of their side pod, so it's more, in my opinion, of a Red Bull Ferrari hybrid than it is a Red Bull copy. And we'll see in a second the comparison between this year's Aston Martin and this year's Red Bull, which is pretty much the same as last year's Red Bull, but a little bit more streamlined, and the undercut is more severe on the side pod. But yeah, I don't know, it's also the back of this side pod, right? So where this dips down, there's a massive slope here behind the side pod, which is honestly kind of Aston Martin's own idea, but it's also taken more inspiration, I would say, from what Ferrari came up with last year in terms of the fishbowl thing in the side pods rather than what Red Bull have. So to me, I don't see that this AMR 23 is like a copy of last year's Red Bull. Yes, they're going to take ideas, but I don't exactly buy the idea that they've copied it and this is basically a green ball. It seems like quite a different car to me. I think they've taken inspiration from all around the grid here, Aston Martin, rather than copied Red Bull, although Red Bull would certainly have you believe that it's basically just their car, but painted green. And this is the side-by-side comparison here, right? I mean, you look at every part of the car, there's some serious differences. Maybe what Red Bull are saying, though, is that it's things that we don't see that are the same. Because if you look at the side pod design, even every other part of the car that we can see from the outside, there are some differences, some similarities, but some serious differences between the two models. But as Mercedes pointed out, the Aston Martin AMR 23 and the Red Bull RB19 and even last year's Red Bull are strong in similar ways. They're quite good over the bumps, in the corners, in the traction zones, and that's where they gain their advantage over the current Mercedes. Is that down to the front suspension? Is that down to the floor design of the car? It's somewhat unclear, but maybe Red Bull think, yeah, damn, Aston Martin, okay, some of these ideas are inspired by us, but it might be the part of the cars that we don't see where the similarities most lie, and why potentially Red Bull are concerned that Aston Martin have taken ideas directly from them by, hiring their engineers during the process of designing last year's car that's now carried over to this year's car. So I don't know. I don't think anything illegal is going on here, right? No matter what Helmut Marko might try to say about the fact that this should be prohibited and it shouldn't be allowed and it's illegal what they've done. I don't exactly buy that idea, to be honest, but it's kind of a natural process here. And Red Bull are quicker anyway, so I don't exactly know why they mind too much. Maybe they're a little bit concerned, though, that Aston Martin are closing in far quicker than they expected them to. Do you guys think as well that Aston Martin and Alonso have a chance to challenge for wins this season? Because Red Bull seem a long way ahead, but it was only one circuit, and other circuits might suit the characteristics of different cars. Red Bull did suffer some issues this weekend as well. They had some reliability concerns. On Friday, their car wasn't performing as expected. Remember last year in Austria where they just set their car up badly and had a terrible weekend compared to Ferrari. And Verstappen does say they're expecting a tougher fight going forwards. I believe Helmut Marko even said that he wouldn't mind a boring year of races where they just win everything, but he expects that rivals will get closer over time. Maybe Aston Martin will be one of them, and if they are, then I'm sure that there'll be more questions and comments coming out of the Red Bull camp as to how similar those cars might have indeed looked. But very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.